All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Alexis Sanchez. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm going to be your moderator for today's workshop, Yes Means Yes, Conversations on Consent. Before I start, I wanted to give a couple housekeeping notes. This is being recorded, although I guess that mostly applies to the panelists here and myself. But if you do have any questions at any point, feel free to ask them in the Q&A or in the chat box. We're also going to have a section towards the end of the workshop where we can kind of, if you want to post scenarios or just general questions we're going to we're going to set aside some time so that the panelists can answer those, because I think making this really interactive is really cool. I wanted to also take a moment to thank the Hollywood chapter of the National Organization of Women, Hollywood Now, for hosting this event. I brought the idea to them about a month or two back. I thought it would be something I think it's something that really needs to be talked about more, and I think a consent-based culture just makes for a safer world and helps to dismantle the patriarchy and helps to do all these really wonderful things. So really quickly, I think I would do a disservice if I tried to introduce our panelists. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves, starting with Anais.
Hi, I'm Anais. My pronouns are she and her. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I work in private practice. I specialize in working with queer individuals, and also a lot of straight men have been finding me, and it's become a new little niche I have, so that I will talk about that later. And I teach sex ed to grades 3 through 12, and I'm really passionate about teaching parents also how to implement consent from an early age in their households and in their communities. That's it.
Great. Thank you. Carly?
Hi, y'all. I'm Carly D. Weckstein. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a sex educator. I started teaching back in the day when I worked at the Pleasure Chest. And kind of the areas I'm most passionate about teaching are just destigmatizing, talking openly about sex, creativity in sex life, and intro to kink and BDSM. I'm also a stage theater director and an intimacy director, which means I help actors and directors choreograph sex scenes on stage that tell the story while also respecting the boundaries of all of the artists involved.
I love that. Thank you two so much for participating.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Well, shall we dive right in?
Let's go.
So I think I want to keep this really current. And like the thing that I've been thinking about a lot when it comes to consent is just that, like, what does that look like during the time of COVID-19? Has COVID-19 our understanding of and the practice of consent? Like, what does consent look like right now?
Well, I think it definitely, COVID-19 has kind of upped the stakes of consent. And it just has made everyone kind of require a next level consent and communication skills. I think we just need those skills to navigate safely, and we have to get creative and also smart about intimacy, because I think closeness to others, physically or otherwise, is something that's essential for survival just as much as safety, and for mental health. And we need community, but we have to be safe and smart, and we have to just really up our communication game, and be honest and direct and clear about boundaries and needs, and be able to hear with grace and accept other people's boundaries and needs.
I think it's also forcing us to have what maybe used to be more difficult conversations, like up front, right in the beginning. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think there's this kind of forced slowdown, as much as there is a sense of urgency about everything, especially in the beginning when there's a poll coming up on my screen right now. Especially in the beginning, the stakes felt very high and we didn't know what was going on and we had no idea how to navigate this. I think we have a little more information now in terms of what actually is safe and interacting with people even from a distance. But consent 101 is yes means yes, right? We have to freely give it. We have to know that it's given in the present moment. For instance, I think there's a lot of parallels. Like if we think about maybe taking risks in some ways too, maybe distance with someone in a park, we may decide that on the drive there, we start to feel a little uncomfortable and maybe we're starting to feel anxious and maybe it no longer feels good. And so we can also opt out at any time. And I think there's really beautiful parallels there with all of this happening and sex in general. And the directness just has to happen. And I think that people generally there's some barriers there for whatever reason that maybe you can talk more about too in your experience, Carly. What gets in the way of communicating and why it's so hard for some of us, I think is important for us to reflect on as well.
Yeah, I love what you said about changing your mind. I think that's one of the essential, foundational pillars of consent is that it's always reversible, that if you feel suddenly that something is unsafe for you, that you're allowed to say that, even if you're on your way to meet somebody at a park, or even if you're about to have sex with somebody, that you're always allowed to change your mind. I think that's one of the most empowering things to know about consent. Something that's come up for me during this is something I've been saying is that COVID bonded is the new fluid bonded, because there's this kind of parallel through that. And by fluid bonded, I mean, if you have a fluid bonded partner, it's somebody that you have sex without protection with. And so that requires this level of communication of, okay, if we are having sex with anybody else, we are using barriers, we are getting tested, etc., or we are not, but just having this very clear communication so that there can be this very vulnerable intimacy. But now kind of COVID bonded is if you are having physical touch with someone, you need to have that same level of communication in terms of saying, this is exactly who I've been close to. These are the risky things that I could have been exposed to. This is the last time I got tested, etc. So I think it, as you said, it just kind of pushes us to be more direct and have some of these conversations off the bat, which I think is a really good thing.
Me too. It actually makes me so hopeful. Also in the slowing down, I've noticed, and myself and people I work with too, the foundation of consent is autonomy. And so we have to be in touch with what it is we actually want, what feels okay for us and what doesn't feel okay for us. And I realize it's a privilege to be able to even slow down and reflect at this point. I realize there are people that are balancing very full lives and are parents and kids and have kids and relationships that actually don't feel safe, that they're having to live in relationship to someone in a house right now. But from the perspective of slowing down, I think it's so important to develop some kind of ritual with ourselves and our own bodies so that we are in touch with ourselves and we know when that gut feeling comes up that it's there to kind of give us information about maybe what we're okay with and what we're not. So I think I'm really hopeful about that too, that people really have had the chance to go a little more inward. And even if they're, chatting with someone online and debating, meeting up with them in person, and maybe sex is part of that down the line, it really is about what you actually want every step of the way. And I think that that's really empowering.
So I'm looking at the answers. The poll question that came up was, are you comfortable talking about consent with a potential partner? And the majority, 73% said yes, but there were a couple of people who said no and who said maybe. So what would be some tips that you two might have for someone who's in the maybe or the no, people who aren't used to having this conversation around consent? What are some things that they can take away?
I think a great place to start could be just framing it in terms of, I want to have a conversation with you so we can be on the same page about what we both want and what we don't want and what makes everybody feel safe so that we can feel good and experience closeness and pleasure together. I think that can be a very inviting way to frame that conversation is one way in.
I think it takes a lot of vulnerability too. And I think in the beginning of having these conversations, it's so powerful just to even show up in a conversation and be like, you know what, I am not used to doing this, but I really want to start to learn how to do it. And I want us both to have an enjoyable experience, a safe experience, all these things. And so you can kind of, deflate the balloon a little bit, pop the air out, air the fear by just owning up front how anxious it could make you. So I think vulnerability is key here.
It's beautiful. I love that. It's such a powerful thing because talking about anything about sex is extremely vulnerable for almost anybody. So I think that for you, if you're feeling, you know, vulnerable or uncomfortable or unsure, to model that is a kind of invitation for the other person to come meet you in that space, and that it's okay to feel uncomfortable or vulnerable.
Totally.
Yeah, I love that. I know I have a practice of, I still get you know, I've made talking about like what my boundaries are. I've been doing it for a while, right? When I first learned about talking about consent and talking about like what for me is okay, what's not okay, what is sometimes okay, depending on where I'm at that day. I think naming it off the bat and saying like, I'm not good at this, I am very nervous right now, that helps to kind of take some of the power out of the nervousness and lets me start to have that conversation with a potential partner. Yeah, I know we talked a little bit about fluid bonding. How do you think COVID has changed the way that we look at relationships, interpersonal as well as romantic?
I think that there's a collective kind of just reflection and examination of our values happening, I think. It's interesting, things that come up with clients I work with and even things I've experienced myself. I've noticed though, interpersonally and even romantically, these issues that are kind of emerging existed well before COVID, but COVID with the urgency and with everything that's happened has just started to really shine light on things that have already existed. So again, I think there's a deepening, and there's also, I think that as people are exploring their boundaries, there's things that we're letting go of things that maybe didn't serve us before. And I think, again, that's okay, but I think there's also a lot of hard feelings to navigate in that with friendships, with, you know, a lot of us are experiencing, I think, kind of regression in this period. There's a lot of old stuff resurfacing, old relationships. There was like that joke in the beginning of this about like reaching out to your exes, or your exes reaching out to you. I was hearing a lot about that in the beginning of this, but again, giving us time to kind of sit with ourselves and examine what it is we actually want out of our relationships. I think I'm noticing a lot of right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's definitely kind of a heightened cherishing and appreciation of the people we do get to touch. If you know, you're someone who's privileged enough to be in that position, I think it's challenging us to be more creative in a lot of ways. And I think creativity really comes from working within constraints. So just like if we're approaching sex and dating and even friendships and even interpersonal relationships, like we're having to navigate and communicate boundaries in friendships, even in ways that I don't think we did as consciously before, because we have different stakes and context. And then for that and for sex and dating, I think it's just really a call of self-gauging, of really, as you said, taking this time to know what you really want and what you're okay with, and tracking your body and kind of going with the flow of how you feel each day, because we're all really on a roller coaster and have so many levels of extra stress right now, that, you know, for some folks, I think can make them lean into sex and romantic relationships. For some folks, it can be really challenging on your sex drive or your vulnerability to be under so much stress. So I think it's really, there's a lot of just needing to be present and patient. And I think for folks who, you know, maybe don't live with a monogamous partner or something, there's the challenge of creativity around sex and dating and connecting. And what does that look like to, if you do not feel ready or safe to have, you know, physical contact with someone, that there are other options. I think sexuality is one of many ways that human creativity is incredible, and that you know, you could have a masked date outside in person. You can have a digital get down. You know, you could send love letters. There's phone sex. There's a lot of kink and role play that don't necessarily even need touch to be involved, like words and self-touching and each other's voices and toys. Like there's a lot of different ways, I think, that we can explore pleasure and connection. And I think that it's a great invitation for everyone to view sex beyond sex is penis in vagina, which is the most incredibly limited view of what sex and pleasure can be.
That's such a great point. I think too, it is expanding the way, I hope for some people, the way we think about pleasure in general, and not even just in a sexual way, but I'll ask people to even, you brought up a great point about noticing in your body. I'll ask people, like, when's the last time you really just felt something pleasurable, and what does it feel like in your body, and how do you connect to yourself through that? And maybe like out taking a walk and looking at trees or whatever it is. It doesn't even have to be sexual, but it's the same feeling in our body, right, that we can note when we're having a pleasurable sexual experience, which again brings us back to, I think, our relationship to ourselves, which is where all of this starts. You brought up the point earlier about grace too, and I think that was so beautiful. Navigating all of this is not easy if you're experiencing some growing pains, even whether you've been partnered for forever, whether you decided, there's people that decided after 3 months of dating someone to quarantine with someone, and probably will be doing that for the rest of the year. That's a huge shift. So having grace with yourself, with your partner, with your friends, with your partners, I think is at the foundation of getting through this, and we will get through it.
I love what you said about like expanding the ways that we experience pleasure, and that it doesn't have to be sexual, but it can be a way to, I don't know, I believe share intimacy. Like if you can't physically be with someone, what if you eat the same ice cream flavor as somebody, like on a Zoom date? There's like this way to engage your senses in this pleasurable, sensual way.
I had a client that was doing Zoom dates and sent the person that he was on a date with like the same takeout. So they were eating the same food on the Zoom date. And it's sweet. And that's what I mean by really slowing things down. I think it's okay. I think it's really good, actually, in a lot of ways.
So earlier, both of you touched a little bit on shame. So I want to bring that up because I think it's really important to talk about. What role does shame play in creating toxic culture in terms of consent and healthy sexual relationships?
I think one of the most harmful things about shame is that it's a silencer. And that when we feel shame, a lot of times we feel we're alone, we're the only person who's experiencing that, and that it would be too embarrassing or vulnerable or something bad in some way to share that. So I think one of the key ways that I see shame being harmful in terms of a culture of consent is that it keeps us from speaking up and saying our needs or our boundaries or our desires.
Yeah, totally agree with that. I think that shame is really kind of rooted in two messages. It's either I'm too much or I'm not enough. And it's one of those that comes out each time, and they're two sides of the same coin. You know, having a feeling, having a desire, wanting something, even as women wanting pleasure, right? There's a sense of that's too much. Like I can't ask for what I need. So unlearning that, I think, is such a process. And in order to unlearn it, I think we have to really kind of let that shame come to the surface and be very gentle with ourselves in that process and kind of get to know it and honestly get intimate with the shame too. Because we are in a relationship with it if we're experiencing it in some way. So even thinking back, I'll ask even parents that I work with to think back to their first kind of experience of when they learned about sexuality, when they learned from another adult, whether it was through their friends, what it was like, what it felt like. All of that we carry with us as adults. So shame is a process of unlearning, and it is learned. We didn't come out of the womb feeling shame. We came out of the womb deserving of pleasure and worthy of it, right?
I love that. That's so beautiful. It's kind of like when you see like videos of really little kids dancing.
Yeah.
They've not learned a sense of like shame yet.
Absolutely.
And that's why they're the best dancers. Because they're just like being in the moment and present in their body.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's really, really powerful. Sometimes we have to name, and notice I'm feeling shame around this so that we can work through it and get a right relationship with it.
And I think that's such a practice. The idea of noticing it. And it's ongoing. We don't just suddenly get rid of shame. I think that it gets easier to kind of acknowledge and be aware of when it's coming up, but
yeah,
I don't know that it just completely goes away. It's so deeply rooted for some of us.
Yeah, it's like you have to work out those muscles, the like shame confronting muscles, and they get stronger the more you do them, but it can be like really hard to like do those lifts at first, especially, or if you haven't practiced for a while. And I think the same goes with consent, just in practicing saying yes and no. I think those are a lot of times, like when I work, whether I'm teaching sex ed or even if I'm doing intimacy with actors, I will just do like a practice exercise of like, you go around the room and you ask people for a high five, and you have to say no some of the time, and how challenging it is to say no and hear no for most folks, because we're not conditioned to do that, to hear no with grace and know that's not about me, that's about them and their boundaries.
Yes.
And also to say no, because for many of us, definitely as women, but for folks of multiple intersections of identities, saying no in certain situations in real life can actually be dangerous. And so I think there's a lot of stuff that can block us from saying and hearing no. So that's another muscle to work out.
Yeah.
And just practicing with very simple things and being like, oh, what does it feel like if I say no to somebody confidently, or if I say no thank you, even if I'm more comfortable with that.
And the celebration of kind of saying no and asserting that and just feeling empowered in that is really important too. It's also, as you're talking, bringing up for me the idea of kind of the more nuances of consent. When we think about even nonverbal consent and navigating that and being present with someone else or multiple people in some kind of sexual encounter, present enough to be able to sense energy and sense what's going on in another person's body, so we can stop and have a check-in.
Yes.
Because yes, we want enthusiastic yes, verbally, ideally, but I think that that's not always the case. So I'm wondering too, just your experience with talking to people about that, teaching people about it.
Yeah, I think that when in doubt, pausing and asking verbally, if you're really not sure, is a great tool. But I think there is a level of kind of emotional intelligence of being able to, if you sense that something feels off, you don't have to just keep going, whether it's in yourself or with somebody else, that you can check in. And that a check-in doesn't mean necessarily we've pulled the plug on the whole thing. We're definitely not going to hook up. Sex is ruined forever. That's not what it is. It's just like a little pause button. Yeah. To be like, do we need to reset? Is everyone's needs getting met? Yeah. I think making it less of a big deal to check in and normalizing that can kind of help take the out from it.
And normalizing that a check-in, as you kind of said, doesn't mean it wasn't a pleasurable experience or wasn't pleasurable up until then. And sometimes maybe you just want to stop and you want to take a break, and it doesn't have to end in orgasm every time, right? There's so many myths that we have to bust down to really normalize checking in, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And that it's perfectly fine to be like, if you were in the midst of something and then being like, this doesn't feel, I'm not in that same place. Like, can we eat an ice cream instead? Can we like watch cartoons instead? Like, we can still have a pleasurable and intimate experience, and we can just kind of change the track. And that doesn't mean that a physical connection can't happen again. It just means it doesn't feel quite right in that moment. And we don't see a lot of narratives of that in the stories that we watch. So totally. we have to make those narratives in our own lives, I think.
Yeah.
I think so much, at least my own experience has been a lot of what I learned about what a sexual encounter would look like comes from what I see in television, right? Like those were some of the first things that I was exposed to, especially like when you don't have parents that really talk about like what sex is and like how to have like good, pleasurable, consensual sex with another person. And so that perpetuated just a lot of those narratives that I carried about what it's supposed to look like. So I wanted to talk about how important it is to educate kids on sex, sexuality, and consent. And why aren't we seeing more people just doing the work and doing that sort of education?
Oh, in my perfect world, we live in a world where every institution, every system, every community is just a community of consent, and it's a lifestyle and it's embodied. And I really, really believe that this starts at such a young age, and we have to be educating young children. And I think sometimes to parents, maybe that feels a little daunting or scary, but when you're educating and teaching young kids about consent, it's really not necessarily sexual. And I think that there are so many ways to just make consent part of your life and their lives. And again, it comes back to autonomy. We want our kids to be autonomous. We want them to understand that they are actually the experts on their own bodies. It's not my job to tell them what to do and to say, you have to give grandma a hug. Let them choose, right? There's all these little ways. Even engaging, like in games at home, giving them a choice. And again, with the check-ins, if you start to notice, maybe someone feels uncomfortable playing with a sibling, or maybe something is shifted in the mood, you simply check in. And this is kind of building a culture and letting children know that they actually have the power within their own bodies to say, yes, this feels good, or no, it doesn't. And it's also teaching kids pleasure, I think, too, from a really young age. But I think that feels really scary for parents. It's like, even in working with parents, again, it's mostly managing all of their own anxiety and making sure that some of their own process around their own sexuality and when they first learned about sex, their feelings of shame around sex, how that's unpacked. And that's an ongoing process for all of us as adults. So I think, to answer the question about why we aren't doing it, I think we have to really do a better job doing the internal work and unpacking all the shame we have around it.
Yeah. I totally agree that teaching kids about consent in young age sex ed is really about empowering them to have autonomy over their own bodies. And that sets them up to be people when they grow up and are in higher stakes situations. So as a children can be in high stakes situations. And as a child, sometimes, do you want to give grandma a hug can feel like a high stakes situation in their experience, if they feel like there's negative repercussions for having a certain answer, for saying no. But I think that, if that message is internalized when a person is young, that like, I have autonomy over my body, I know what feels good or what feels right and wrong to me from a young age, that when they grow up and start dating or even just relating to other humans as they become more and more complex humans, that really sets them up for success. And so I think it's really empowering, and it's not about exposing children to sexuality. It's about exposing them to being empowered to live in their own body. I mostly teach adults sex ed, but a number of them, have kids and ask about that. This is maybe my favorite sex ed book. That's actually
Mine too.
Kid's book. Yes, it's so good. It's
so
called
good.
Sex is a Funny Word, by Corey Silverberg and Fiona Smith. The illustrations are amazing. But it frames sex under the principles of respect, trust, joy, and justice, which is just revolutionary. I think all adults should read this book.
I think so too. What it also does really beautifully is that I think parents get so overwhelmed in needing to give the most accurate information. It's okay to not know. It's okay to even say to your kid, I don't know the answer to that, I'll get back to you. But also that book does really beautifully is it kind of frames just open-ended questions. So kids get to think about things like, why do you think that people, when a baby's being born, need to say it's a boy or it's a girl? Why do you think that it's so binary, right? And within language that can speak to them. So it gets their wheels turning too about what they actually believe, and kind of gets them in touch with their own values, which is how they become empowered adults.
Yeah, that's one of my
I love
favorite
his work. Yeah.
That's one of my favorite parts too, is the kind of open-ended questions that it can either be okay, go off and think about this, or you can have a discussion with your kid about this. Yeah, love.
Because it's ongoing conversations too. It's not just one talk.
Right.
Yeah.
There's not the sex talk.
Yeah. I mean, for most of us, if we had anything, that's what we had though.
Right.
As
right.
adults.
Yeah. But I think all adults should read this book too.
Me too.
This wouldn't be a complete consent workshop if we weren't talking about toxic masculinity, and I really wanted to make sure we had a solid chunk of time to talk about that. What do you think the role of toxic masculinity is in, perpetuating like sexism and transphobia and misogyny in our bigger culture?
Oh gosh, I mean, I think it's important to name a couple main aspects of toxic masculinity, or like, equating violence as power and equating independence as power and status, masking emotions. And I really believe that toxic masculinity harms folks of all genders, including men. And just it perpetuates this idea that men have to be independent, not need anyone, not show emotions. And I think it just robs them of a chance to be a vulnerable human and a nuanced human, and to relate to other humans in that way. And I think that can create a lot of harm and violence, and misogyny and transphobia from that.
That's such a beautiful point too. And I think in a lot of ways, the violence and what we see is in reaction to men actually want intimacy. And I do really believe that the majority of them want to be seen. And there were so many unmet needs in childhood, or for whatever reason, men need that and want it. So the reaction to that is, I think, a lot of shame, and how it comes out is violence. It's power. It's about dominating. These are key aspects we think about when we think about toxic masculinity. It's what makes it toxic. The idea too of like performance, needing to perform during sex, and sex as a conquest. I see sex as a conquest, by the way, in every community I work with. It's not just with straight men, it's with everyone. And it's damaging to our relationship to sex and to pleasure, and that goes for men as well. And so I think that was a really important point to make. So thank you.
I think it's interesting even to look at the language that's used around sex. Like, it is very conquest-based language. Like, did you get some? Did she give it up? Like, it's a thing that is someone takes from somebody else instead of being a shared experience, which is actually what I believe that it's meant to be.
Yeah, there's a great sexuality educator, I'm sure you know him, Al Vernacchio, which looks at the baseball metaphor for sex, which is all the bases, which is what we used to have, I guess, growing up. I wasn't really told it, but I remember, kids talking about, like, did you get to third base? Right. That is, like, it's a conquest, and it's men needing to get to penetration, and then women become objects, right, of sexual desire. But he kind of talks about sex being more like a pizza. So it is a collaboration. You have to sit down and you order something, but you have to talk about it. And what you want one day may not be the same thing you want on your pizza the next day. But it expands this kind of conquest model of teaching kids about sex too, which I love, even for adults. Because again, most adults are unlearning this, and we have to.
Yeah. I love that pizza metaphor, because it's like there's a negotiation. Okay, we're both going to eat this pizza, so what toppings do we both enjoy? And if there's a topping you're allergic to or you really don't like, even if the other person likes it sometimes, it's not going to go on that pizza.
Yeah.
I love food metaphors.
Me too.
Most relatable.
I also think it kind of, in deconstructing toxic masculinity, you have to realize that in relationship to others, we are allowed to have private sexual worlds, and again, to be autonomous. So we have to view our partners and celebrate our partners as autonomous and not things that we get to possess, and should not be threatened by our partners, whether it's sexual, whether it's romantic, both and all of it, to not be threatened by that as something we didn't quote unquote get, or something we need to keep. And I think that toxic masculinity plays a big role in that kind of mentality too.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's all connected, like all of shame, toxic masculinity, educating children about consent. It's all connected to like autonomy, empowering people to have autonomy over their bodies and their pleasures and their experiences.
Also, I was thinking too the other day about, we mentioned it earlier, but dealing with rejection, and teaching kids how to deal with rejection, especially male identifying people, that it's not personal and it does not directly reflect how much of a man, quote unquote, you are, right? How problematic is that? Because then once we experience rejection, if we haven't learned that and we personalize it, it becomes something that we I think, kind of weaponized, and then it does become violent or shame-based because we feel not enough, right? There's so much not enoughness in this, as I talked about with shame, when it comes to what it means to, quote unquote, be a man.
I wanted to also make sure we took a little time to talk about like consent when it comes to the LGBTQ community and like what does consent look like when you're queer, right? I think especially when it comes to men who have sex with men, there's like a hyper masculine culture that sometimes really kicks consent by the side. I think for trans people, like consent has always been at the forefront for myself as a trans person because I really have to communicate with my partner, like with my body, like this is what's okay, this is what's not okay. So what are some things that maybe you've seen in your practices or in your study of it that you think would be relevant? Also, while you're thinking on those answers, I wanted to remind the audience that if you have any questions, we're going to start fielding questions in about 5-10 minutes. So please put those either in the Q&A or in the chat box.
I think off the bat, and even as a queer woman, and this is something I'm still learning, and it's come up a lot in COVID in terms of like communicating with people more virtually. From the get-go, you got to kind of say what you want. I mean, it's just like, hey, just so you know, like this date's like a friendship thing, like I'm not looking for a relationship, or like there's a level of directness, I think, which I actually think like heterosexual people could benefit from too. But we kind of are faced with that up front. That's what's coming up for me initially.
Yeah, I think that there's a, while there's a cultural difference, I think that there is the same kind of principles of, as you said, direct communication and of I think something that's really useful universally for consent is checking in with yourself, having that conversation with yourself before you take it to somebody else, and going through kind of like what one of my favorite consent navigation tools is a yes, no, maybe list. I love lists. They're very fun for some of us, but it could be a great way just to gauge your own boundaries and desires of just writing down things like, yes, these are things that most of the time I am super game for, I would love to have in my sex or my intimacy, and then knows things that you're like, this is a hard boundary and I've practiced saying that, so I can take that to someone else and confidently, or even if I'm feeling vulnerable and nervous, like I've made that firm with myself so that I can take that to someone else. And then the maybe section, which is kind of like, it depends on the day and the situation and the specifics of it. And so I think kind of taking the time to check in with yourself and your relationship with yourself and your own desires and boundaries is one of the most powerful tools that you can have when navigating consent with anybody else.
I actually think we've got a lot to learn, and the trans clients I've worked with, I think we've got a lot to learn from that community in terms of communicating about language up front, because language is really important to communicate about up front when it comes to actual bodies. So I think that that's something that I for sure have learned a lot from in terms of working more with trans individuals. And then I think, and reflective upon the hypersexualization that happens in gay male world. And I think if you've lived a life of repression in some way and, you come out, unfortunately, I can speak to pockets of communities here in LA, and I know it's different everywhere, but there is this, okay, in order to be a gay male, you need to hypersexualize others and lead with sex. And again, there's some of that toxic masculinity that comes in there when it comes to seeing sex as a conquest. And so I think that that's something to really examine and something that I'm always really curious about too.
I love what you said about language, and that I think queer folks and straight folks can take from that, of the specifics of language are is very important. And that can be another thing to negotiate with yourself and someone else, especially if you are someone who likes to be verbal during sex, and just like to check in with yourself with like, what do I like my body parts to be called? What words turn me on? What words turn me off? And to communicate that, and what phrases or names, even if you want to get a little like kinky or dirty talk, that kind of creates this amazing like cheat code almost for your partner, in terms of like, this is language that makes me feel hot, that makes me feel sensual, that makes me feel seen, that make like you are seeing who I am. And these are things that I don't want you to use these words when we're intimate together. That's, as I said, my love of lists, but that's another really great one. And that can kind of be a fun game almost that you can do, the yes, no, maybe, or the worksheet of like words for body parts and for names and dirty talk, that you can do even in this socially distant time. Like that could be, if you're considering getting, physical with somebody, that could be a really hot date while you were in different places, to fill out these and share them with each other, because there is something incredibly intimate and vulnerable with sharing that information with somebody else. And really exciting about like, oh, when can I get to use these words?
I think it's a great exercise too, especially now, to even set aside some space for yourself to even sit down and, tap into fantasy life, tap into all of that. What are your desires? There's something about sexting too, right? Seeing something written out, it really does give us practice for what we actually want. And I think it's cool. I agree with everything you said.
So there's a great question here in the chat. How have dating and hookup apps changed the game in terms of consent and sex? Are they just tools to further the toxic culture we're trying to dismantle, or are they useful?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it really, that they could go either way, kind of depending on how we're using them. And if we're kind of doing that internal work first, or if we're just diving into them. Because I think using them mindlessly can really further a lot of toxicity around toxic masculinity or conquest mentality or shame and shame around rejection. But I think that they have the possibility, if we are like, okay, I want to be like in right relationship with dating and hookup apps. And so I'm going to, be mindful and be like, what do I want to get out of this? What am I hoping to get out of this? What are my boundaries going into this? Like if there's a certain boundary or red flag that pops up with someone I'm talking with, that I'm going to, as a part of actively like loving and respecting myself, if I see this, I'm not going to put any more time and energy into that person. So I think there can be really positive ways to use them.
I agree. I don't think that they're inherently a bad thing, but I think we have to step back and examine our relationship to them. Just as you said, it's like, are these apps using us, or are we using them?
Yeah.
Like truly, because there's too much mindless getting on. And now I know I harped on this being a really positive time for connection earlier, but we can also swing the other way and see the apps used as kind of just a distraction. You're feeling lonely. And so many people are feeling lonely right now. And I totally empathize with that. I've been alone through all of this as well. But can I also go inward and really examine what I want out of a relationship, what I want out of a hookup even, what do I want? And can I use the apps healthily? I think there has to be both. Right. And they can exist at the same time.
Yeah. And noticing, like, especially if you're like, okay, maybe I've had an unhealthy way that I use these apps in the past, like just being honest with yourself about that, just a part of confronting maybe the feeling of shame around that, and say, and getting clear with yourself, this is how I want to use them. And if I notice myself repeating patterns that have been like harmful to me in the past, then I'm going to like take a break for this amount of time, just like letting yourself be in relationship with how you use the apps, and noticing, is this causing me more stress or numbing or anxiety, or is this a way that I'm able to actually connect?
Mm-hmm.
So we have another great question here, and I'm just going to read it directly. I've been dealing with a lot of friends wanting to find love during this safer at home order, but they need to find some love internally first. How do you work with people to use the time to do an internal search of what or who they are versus finding someone to fill the gap?
Get a therapist, first step. I mean, obviously I'm a little biased, but I really, really deeply believe that. And as a therapist, I can speak to this. Yeah, that is what you tell them, I see. I can speak to this with a lot of compassion, first of all. So if you have friends that are experiencing this, I think we can be gentle and again, come back to the grace with each other. I want to humanize, like, yes, of course you're feeling lonely and it may feel like a quick fix and a distraction to quote unquote find love, but maybe just some gentle questioning around, again, the intention there. That's where I would start as a therapist and just be really curious, like really deeply curious with what is going on with someone. And I wanted to just like, this is to note how intimate and how much we can grow closer to ourselves through our friendships. So this is also a time to deepen platonic relationships. Platonic relationships can be so intimate, and a great model, I think, for our future relationships. And we don't have to subscribe to finding like the one, right? And then it's it's kind of toxic monogamy culture as well that I think now is a good time to break down.
Yeah, those are all such good points. I definitely agree. And second, the therapy is an incredible tool if you can access that. And there's lots of ways. And I think that taking the time to be like, okay, what am I hungry for that I'm looking for outside of myself? And how could I give that to myself more? Or exactly as you said, how can I get this from my other platonic relationships? Mm-hmm. I think we really have, our culture really teaches us, the world teaches us that you're supposed to get everything you need from one other person. And that doesn't set us up for success in a lot of ways. And it discounts the ways that having a community and having friendships and family can feed and enrich our life. And yes, it's amazing to have a fulfilling relationship with a partner, but that's not all there is. And yeah, so I think really taking time to reflect, what am I hungry for? What do I feel like I'm missing? Where can I get those needs met from myself? And where can I get those needs met through platonic relationships that I already have? Like water the gardens that you already have, which is relationship with self and friends.
And there's never been a better time.
Yeah.
I love that. Water the gardens you already have. The next question comes with a little bit of a content warning. How do we deal with the harmful aspect of when consent is not given? We often see violence occur to inflict harm on our bodies and souls. And the second part of the question, how can we get people to a mindset and framework of consent is sexy?
Well, my first response, there's a lot of pieces to that, and I might need a little clarification. But my first response is this motto and framework of consent is sexy. I see where it's helpful, but I also see where that's harmful, just in terms of like, can we cross out sexy and write mandatory? Like this is just kind of like a baseline foundation that is needed to have a respectful exchange with integrity and autonomy. And then if you have that foundation, then we can get into pleasure and sexiness and desire. But I guess, how do we deal with the harmful aspect when consent is not given? In terms of like, if we're witnessing that, if we're experiencing it ourselves, I think that normalizing the conversation about this and talking openly about the importance of consent is one way that we, each as individuals, do have power to kind of be a fractal and one piece in a microcosm of shifting towards a culture of consent. Even having conversations, not with people we're dating or having sex with or hooking up with, but just with our friends and in our communities. I think that just normalizing the importance of consent and what it actually means and looks like, and that talking about it is not shameful and it doesn't have to be super intense or heightened every time we talk about it, I think is one very healing and empowering thing that any individual can do to help us collectively shift.
I think so too. And I think that goes back to making consent just a lifestyle that we live, even beyond sex and beyond sexuality. Asking for hugs, asking and checking in, like, do you have emotional space right now to talk with me even? That's been really important for me during this time, that people ask me that, and then I'm asking that of people as well. So I just think we have to do a better job infiltrating in all of our communities beyond just sex. And then also, yes, talking about it in terms of sex, so that should something happen, you know, that didn't feel right or didn't sit well, that maybe wasn't an enthusiastic yes consent, we are able to hold space for others to a certain extent and be there in a way. Not that, you know, having a professional to talk to is the most important, I would say, for someone healing from any of this work, and not just a therapist, but someone that specializes in sexual trauma, I think is really, really important, because not every therapist is able to have open conversations about sex and sexuality, and B, to handle helping heal sexual trauma. So I would first and foremost say we have to work on that as well as a field.
So here's another question from the chat. I've discovered that a lot of my friends who are young parents have a hard time having conversations with their kids about our discussion today. They're mostly back in my conservative home state, but they tell me to go tell their kids about sex or that it's okay to be LGBT. What are some advice you give to non-experts on how to talk about these complex issues on a simple level?
I'm just reading through the question again. So
Yeah,
they ask this person to go talk to their kids? Is that what I'm reading?
That was how I interpreted it.
So you're like tokenized. Cool. Okay. Yeah, the cool uncle. I get it. Okay. Well, first and foremost, whether parents like it or not, if you bring a child into this world, you are their primary sexuality educator. And I tell adults that all the time. Like, you don't really have a choice. So yes, it is absolutely the parent's responsibility. Again, it can feel really scary, but there's so many windows of opportunities to kind of do this in an artful way, where it's not some big dramatic sit down, like, here's what sex is. Driving in the car, I recommend parents to do all the time, like just talking about something, maybe it comes up, and kids don't really have to make eye contact with you. They don't have to really engage in the same way that a big sit down they would engage with. Using TV shows they're interested in, media, all of these are windows in. And so it can start at a super, super young age, even the kind of toys your kids are playing with. All of these, there can be creative ways to kind of prompt conversation. And even if your kid doesn't want to talk about it, even if you are like the cool uncle and maybe they don't want to have a sit down, they at least know that you're someone you can go to. And I think to really make ourselves askable as adults, we can open up these windows. If kids don't want to talk immediately, it's okay, but they know that we're there. That feels really important. Just to kind of like humanize to parents too, that this is uncomfortable for a lot of parents, and that's okay. Again, that's where your internal work goes as parents. But to kind of model just all of this feels really important too. And that doesn't require any talking, it's just your actions.
Yes. Wow. All of that is brilliant. I love this car idea where it's like, you know, there is this level of distance and you can just talk, and kids don't necessarily have to be making eye contact. That's really brilliant. Yeah, I would definitely agree with modeling and using examples of what's already happening. Because a lot of times kids will hear a song or see a movie or, you know, and be like, what is that? Or like, that makes me feel funny, or like, what, you know, like they might have their own reaction. And so meeting it with not this like shame and this is such a big deal and it's scary. It's like it's that same thing of like if a kid like falls down and then gets up, sometimes they look to the parent, and if the parent is like freaking out, then they freak out. They're like, oh no, it's so bad. But if the parent is like, you're okay, then they'll be like, yeah, I'm okay. So I think the way that parents can like just react to their kids. And there's kids love imagination games and like playing with little figures and stuff. And so I think there's opportunities to introduce, like what if there's two Superman and Spider-Man and they kiss, and be like, yeah, they can do that. That's fine. Or if they're like, no, they can't, to ask the kid the question, well, why do you think that? Why is that? Why would you not do that? I think is just kind of integrating it into play, imagination, and stories that they are already experiencing or telling is a great way to have the discussion about this just be a thread in normal existence rather than like a big, scary, serious event.
I think so too. I think there's too much focus. Parents start to freak out about quote unquote getting it right. Instead of then, when you're focused so much on your own anxiety and getting it right, we're not really tending to the big feelings that come up for kids around all of this. If, for instance, their reaction to playing with the two dolls that were kissing that were same sex, and the reaction was like, ew, I would want to really be curious about my child's feelings about that and really tend to that in a non-shaming way. But if we're too focused on getting it right, we miss their whole experience of kind of being a sexual being. They're a sexual being from the time they're in the womb. Again, whether we like it or not. So we have to tend to feelings, which I don't think we do enough.
I love that point about like getting too caught up on doing it just right, or doing it perfectly and not making any mistakes with their kid. We're humans. We're all going to make mistakes. Like, we're learning to human as we are being humans, like throughout the whole process. So I think that just being present and doing your best is not only a more realistic goal, but like a more kind of holistic and healing way to do that. And just knowing like, sometimes I'm going to mess up, and then you can name and model that for your kid too. Like, oh, I made a mistake, or like, when I said this, I want to talk about it again because I think I said it wrong.
Yeah. There's always room for repair. I tell parents this all the time. If you've said something and it doesn't sit well, just as you're saying, go back to your child and have the repair, have the conversation. I think it's really, really powerful. And sometimes it feels like, especially when we get into like pre-pubescent and teenager years, it feels like things aren't landing and they no longer like want to hear from you or talk to you about some of this. But I promise you, it matters. What you say matters, and what you model matters. So I think modeling repair is really important.
So we have a question here at the Q&A. I'm going to answer this one. We're just about at time, so I think this is going to be our last question. Can you recommend any reading on unlearning our messaging around consent, specifically for early 30 queer femmes? Sorry if this was already covered. And then anything you recommend, we'll also take a note of it and send it in the post email that we send out to everyone.
Something I love for queer women, which is like my go-to, and I'm sure you know it, Carly, and it just kind of helps like relearn things that maybe you never even learned about your body, is Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski. It's a great place to start. It's not as much just about consent itself, but it's more about just the body. And I learned so many things from it, and she's got a really beautiful way of articulating the information as well. That's where I would start. It feels really foundational.
Yeah, that's a fantastic book. There's another great book that definitely has some really charged material, but it's actually the name of our session today. Yes Means Yes, by Jacqueline Friedman and Jessica Valenti. They're actually it's a collection of essays that's visions of female sexual power in a world without rape, and that is more specifically focused on consent and affirmation and healing from the world that we live in that is not yet a consent culture. But yeah, there's a lot of really good essays in that book too.
I would love to develop like a reading list around this. I think this is something that we could probably just add on to, and I would love to work my way through that over the course of the next year. Do either of you have any closing thoughts or anything that you want to leave our attendees with?
I think I would just say, like, yeah, have a lot of patience, grace, and kindness with yourself and others as you're navigating it through this really, really hard and stressful time. Especially with yourself. I find that that's the place where we can often have the most frustration. And to take advantage of the time and the space and the slowing down if you have that, in terms of getting in right relationship with yourself and your body and your pleasure, and knowing that it's not going to be a check off these things in order and now I'm great forever. That it's like always an ongoing journey, but that even when it can be exhausting or painful in parts, that it can also be really fun and pleasurable and joyful in a lot of parts, and that exploring that with yourself is a great way to eventually be able to explore that with other folks and share that, and also just as a way to give yourself some power and autonomy in this world right now is pleasure and joy are amazing things.
Yeah, I would echo all of that, and I would also to my own therapist recently, I was like really panicking, processing, taking a certain risk that I wanted to be safe about. It was like going back to a yoga class when they opened up, and I was having so much anxiety about it. And it kind of struck me, her response to me. So I did all the internal work around it, and then her response to me was just a very gentle, give yourself permission to change your mind. You thought that yesterday that was too much for you, but today you're kind of curious about it. And I think that that's really just right now, especially in this time, giving ourselves permission to change our mind. That goes for consent, that goes for sex, it goes for all relationships, to kind of just ride out the fluidity of this and accept the not knowing. Like, we don't know what the next 6 months is like. We don't know what tomorrow is like. It's not even a day by day continuation at this point for me. It's a literal one day, then the next day. Every day is different. So we actually didn't have a lot of answers pre-COVID. So we already were living in the unknown. We're just forced to kind of grapple with that now. So give yourself permission to change your mind and kind of embrace the unknown right now as a time for self-reflection.
Those were both just so wonderful. Thank you both so much for coming on for this discussion. This will still be on the Hollywood Now Facebook page. We live streamed it, so if you want to share it out afterwards for anyone, you can just blast it out using social media. We'll send out a post email as well with some of the recommendations in terms of books and materials. Thank you so much to the Hollywood chapter of the National Organization of Women for hosting this, and I hope all of you leave with some gentle kindness for yourself and for everyone around you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank
this
you,
was
Carly.
So wonderful. Thank you.
I learned a lot from you. Thank you.
Same.
Thank you.